English working class consciousness and the Irish worker. Here we go. The Irish immigrant was an important element in the industrial English working class. By 1841, 100,000 Irish born immigrants were living in Great Britain.
400,000.
What? 400,000.
400,000.
He was he was, as Thompson describes the Irish worker of the earlier 19th century, quote, the cheapest labor in Western Europe. Irish workers were recruited and used to fulfill the heavy manual occupations at the base of industrial society, which required a spendthrift expense of sheer physical energy and alternation alternation of extensive labor and boisterous relaxation, which belongs to pre-industrial labor rhythm, and for which the English artisan or weaver was in, unsuited, both by reason of his weakening physique and his um, Puritan temperament. Sorry. Still, Thompson's explanation for the need to complement the English working class was not the irrational that prevailed at the time. Engels was much closer to the English manufacturing class, and perhaps more accurate in his assessment of their motives when he observed that, quote, the Irish have discovered the minimum of necessity of life and are now making the English worker acquainted with it. For whatever it is worth, it would have been inconsistent with the tenets of Anglo-Saxonism to detach the English worker from the racial hierarchy that was quite adequate in locating the deficiencies of the Irish race, quote unquote. The Irish worker, having descended from the inferior race, who descended from an inferior race, so his English employers believe the cheap market value of his labor was but its most rational form. Setting aside for the moment popular prejudice, the English working classes, especially those at the industrial core of English industry, had more occasion than their superiors to form very different attitudes towards their Irish counterparts. Indeed, in the early 19th century, the opportunities for the formation of a successful social movement built on Irish and English workers were frequent and seemed promising. Irish labor leaders took prominent roles in working class agitation in England. In the Chartist movement, for example, and it is a widely held belief that working class movements and organizations in England in general were modeled from Irish organizational methods. The extent to which the direction of a unified and racial working class movement had been realized and subsequently so easily dispatched in the early 19th century has troubled at least one historian of the period so deeply that it has occasioned uncharacteristic speculations. E. P. Thompson, reviewing the observation that Engels had made on the positive revolutionary effects consequent to the mixture of the two races in the working class, the more facile, acceptable, fiery Irish temperament with the stable reasoning, preserving English, himself paused to reflect on the political possibilities that English capitalist production had inevitably produced. It was an advantage to the employers at a time when precision engineering coexisted with tunneling by means of shovel and pick to be able to call upon both types of labor. But the price which had been paid was the confluence of sophisticated political racialism with the more primitive and excitable revolutionism. This confluence came in the Chartist movement once before in 1790s. It seems possible that English Jacobinism and Irish nationalism would engage in a common revolutionary strategy. If O'Connor had been able to carry Ireland with him as he carried the north of England, then the Chartist and Young Ireland movements might have come to a common insurrectionary flashpoint. What were you going to say? I think you said something. I didn't hear you.
Radicalism. You get
Radicalism.
radicalism and racialism. You gotta watch those two.
I know those are hard for me. I get those two mixed up. So not racialism, radicalism. Chartism, however, proved to be the high point of cooperation between Irish and English elements of the working class in England. This movement, organized behind a people's charter, the platform of universal suffrage, annual parliaments and parliamentary salaries, and represented by demonstrations, petitions, riots, and rebellions, though neither politically nor ideological homogeneous, had once held the promise of an enduring organization. Instead, it collapsed totally from within and without. After the late 1840s, the tentative efforts that might have resulted in a politically significant class solidarity were frustrated by events of both political and economic character. In England itself, the defeat of the Chartist protest came with the extent of and kind of reaction of the English ruling class, aptly recounted by Thomson. It was the organ of middle-class radicalism, the Times, which led the outcry, for example, of severity. The advice was followed. Quote, on the 9th of January 1831, judgment of death was recorded against 23 prisoners for the destruction of a paper machine in Buckingham. In Dorset, on the 11th, against 3 for extorting money and 2 for robbery. At Norwich, 55 prisoners were convicted of machine breaking and rioting. At Ipswich, 3 were extorted for extorting money. At Petworth, 26 for machine breaking and rioting. At Gloucester, open wards of 30. At Oxford, 29, and in Winchester, out of upward of 40 convicted, 6 were left for execution. In Salisbury, 44 prisoners were convicted. End quote. It was a Whig ministry. Again, when they mean Whigs, I think they mean like Tories, like the left ministry. Again, that sanctioned 3 years later the transportation of the laborers of, oh my gosh, Tolpuddle in Dorsetshire, who had the insolence to form a trade union. Following this era of overt class warfare and its accompanying persecution, the English working class, as we have seen, turned towards trade unionism as its primary form of activity. In part, this was also a reflection of the social consciousness concomitant to the growth of English trade and production. The English worker in the second half of the 19th century began to enjoy certain and the prerequisites of a labor aristocracy and a world system. In Ireland, the late 1840s was a time of the great harvest disaster that came to be known as the potato famine or the Great Hunger. Its immediate consequences were both the momentous immigration from Ireland to the United States and the participation of an even more extreme nationalism among Irish men, both home and abroad. Together, these political and economic setbacks, on the one hand, to English and Irish industrial workers, and on the other hand, to Irish farmers, peasants, and industrial workers in Ireland, resulted in both the ideological and physical drifting apart of the two races. From the mid-19th century on, among English workers, the ideology of English nationalism gained ascendancy over the counter ideology of international class solidarity and socialist hopes. This was a part of the conservative reaction, trade unionism, to political defeat and economic growth, but it also had to do with the radical direction of Irish working classes and the nationalist Irish middle class had taken. As Marx has often stated in one fashion or another, quote, the English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. Early on, of course, it had been the presence of the Irish immigrants as a distorting and depressive element in the labor market that had produced markedly anti-Irish sentiments among English workers. This hostility had merely confirmed the complemented the racial, is that radical? That's racial, feelings extant among England's ruling classes, the historical basis of which we trace above. Later, from the 1850s on, the development of sympathy among English workers towards Irish nationalism became even more remote with the appearance of Irish radical middle-class nationalism, the Home Rule movement, and the more radical peasants and working-class nationalist movement that assumed the form of a revolutionary agrarian movement. By the end of the 19th century, the English people were at one with respect to the Irish question. Whatever expectations existed, they were associated with political weaknesses and inconsequentiality. All right. Any questions? Any questions you have, Miss them? Sorry. Thank you, Kevin.
Doing good.
No questions. Okay. The proletariat. Next section. A proletariat in the English working class. The terms English and Irish have been used in a preceding discussion for convenience. It would have been most difficult to be both precise while treating the subject at an appropriate length. One hopes, however, that such convenience have not escaped the reader's attention, giving the consistent emphasis here on ethnic and culture conservatism. I gotta look up this word. Let's find out what the word means.
Looks like conservatisms, but I don't know. That word's hard.
Keeps trying to autocorrect it to conservatism. It won't let me do it. And their importance, sorry. Though Ireland is but a small island, the integration of the Irish people was by no means an accomplished fact by the time of the Great Famine and the major immigration from Ireland in the 19th century. Indeed, some students of the immigration are quite specific as to the region's local cultures, dialect groups, and occupations from which successive immigrants were drawn and how these particularities influenced historical movements. The Irish people had been in the process of achieving a national identity and a national culture since the Norman-led conquest. They had not done so when the time came for the masses relocation that was marked their collective history for the past 200 years. Theirs is then a national identity deeply marked by Irish dispersion. Yeah. But even more to the point, we have seen that the generic terms, quote, the English working class or the English proletariat, mask the social and historical realities that accompany the introductions of industrial capitalism in England and its empire. Social division and habits of life and attitude that predated capitalist production continued into the modern era and extended to the working classes located in Britain, specific social sensibilities of consciousness. The English working class was never the singular social and historical entity suggested by the phrase. And even closer study of its elements, for we have merely reviewed the more extreme case with the Irish, would reveal the other social divisions, some ethnic, Welsh, Scottish, and more recently, West Indian and Asia, some regional and other essentially industrial and occupational. The negation resultant from capitalist mode of production, relations of production, and ideology did not manifest themselves as a eradication of opposition among the working classes. Instead, the dialect of proletarianization disciplined the working classes to the importance and distinctions between ethnics and nationalities, between skilled and unskilled workers, and, as we shall see later, in even more dramatic terms, between races. The persistence and creation of such opposition within the working class were a critical aspect of the triumph of capitalism in the 19th century. Neither Marx nor Engels was aware of the proletarian failures to become a universal class, but both studied the Irish question closely, were active in the attempt to resolve its distinctive impact on the historical process of English working class formation, and commented on its import for future proletarian organization. Nevertheless, the impact of their experience with the English proletariat on their theory of the proletarians' historical roles appears to have been slight. Chamolo Averneri observes that the universalistic nature of the proletariat does not disappear in Marx's later writings. When his decisions concentrates mainly on the historical causes of the emergence of the proletariat. What was at the outset a philosophical hypothesis is verified by historical experiences and observation. The universalistic nature of the proletariat is a corollary of the conditions of production in a capitalist society, which must strive for universality on the geographical level as well. This appeared to confirm one of Engels' most famous estimation of their work. Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principles vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it, and we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to allow other elements involved in the interaction to come into the rights. But when it was a case of presenting a section of history, that is, of a practical application, it was a different matter, and there no error was possible. Engels was absolutely correct, though. The instance of which he was immediately responding might I can't. Oh my gosh, that word's killing me.
That word is
Decisive?
deceive.
Deceive. Sorry, might deceive. Jesus Christ. The distinctions that Engels was making here between history and theory can at one level be read as an attempt to differentiate between the functions of the publicists and the scientific philosophers. Such an interpretation would in fact trivialize Engels' intent. Like Marx, Engels understood that their attempt to construct a total system of, quote, materialist conception of history would bear the imprint of their historical moment. Not only ideology and philosophy, but all human activity was of such a nature. So they're talking about how they engage in dialectical materialism, and materialism is the movement. We make our history ourselves, but in the first place, under very definite assumptions and conditions. Among these economic ones are ultimately decisive, but the political ones, etc., and indeed even the traditions which haunt human minds also play a part, although not a decisive one. What history demonstrated to Marx and Engels was that dialectical change was never a total negation of the condition from which it generated, but a transformation of the meaning, intent, and the directionality of the elements and forces of the pre-existing whole. This meant that their work itself, the critique of bourgeois society, the industrial capitalism, would someday, when the material forces of society had progressed beyond their stage of development in the 19th century, be subject to criticism, negation. That which was ideological, partial consciousness in their study of history would be transcended by a necessarily higher form of social thought corresponding to its historical moment. Perhaps the most obvious of the ideological construction that appears in the work of Marx and Engels, and most of the Marxists who have followed them, are the notions of the proletariat as a revolutionary subject, and the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. They persist in Marxian thought, in precisely the terms suggested by Isaiah Berlin. The Marxist doctrine of movement and dialectical collisions is not a hypothesis liable to be made less or more uncovered by a non-empirical historical method, the validity of which is not questioned. To comprehend this haunting, quote unquote, of radical European thought and its Eurocentrism, it becomes appropriate to review the socialist tradition from which Marx and Engels emerged, and that had for its historical setting the late 18th century and the early 19th century. Here we will discover the grounding of the pattern that thrust European Marxism into an era for which it was not prepared, the modern world. Chapter 3. Any questions?
Nope. I'm enjoying it though.
Chapter 3. Socialist Theory and Nationalism. Scientific socialism has become accustomed to locating the source of their observational points in the modern era in the 19th century, but in truth, it is the scientism of the 19th century to which they refer. It was the political and intellectual critique of capitalism, the exposition to the alienation of labor, and the ordering of social life according to the dictates and requirements of private property that could be traced to 19th century sources. On the other hand, their socialism had its ideological, analytical, and theoretical beginnings in even earlier times. As such, the beginning of modern socialism, though likewise committed to the ultimate rationalization of society, were informed by a fundamental different concept of the project than that socialism had resulted from the ideological collision with German materialism, industrial production, and the revolutionary events of the early 19th century. Prior to the 19th century, what has sometimes been referred to as a socialist vision was a species of a moral and architectonic tradition that had penetrated European thought in the form of ethical systems and consideration preserved for the civilization of Egypt, ancient Greece, Asia Minor, Norman Cohen states, like the other fantasies which have gone to make up the revolutionary, oh my gosh, what is this word? Eschatology. We're going to find out what that word means. That's a new word. No, I want this word. All right, back.
Sounds good. I would like to say for the record that I am looking at this word and I could not have pronounced it better.
Eschatology. It's eschatology. Will it
What's
come
it
up?
mean?
I'm about to. No? There you go.
Oh. The branch of theology concerned with last things, specifically the final destiny of humanity, the world, and individual souls. Cool.
Sweet. Eschatology of Europe, egalitarian and communistic fantasies can be traced back to the ancient world. Christianity, of course, was an important conduit in the intervening ages, but interesting enough, the growing power, wealth, and human properties of the church, an important focus of medieval socialism, did not obviate the retention of enunciation of a communistic doctrine. For more than a millennia and a half, often based upon suspicious ecclesiastical authority.
Species. 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 It
Yeah,
means like having to do with the species.
okay. Authority. It became a commonplace amongst canonists and scholastics that in the first state of society, which has also been the best state, there had been no such thing as private property because all things had belonged to all people. Indeed, the communal life was taught and practiced among both the monastic and lay lower orders of the church. The church thus incorporated the opposition of feudal privilege and Christian dogma. Eventually, this contradiction would erupt, forming the heresies of the 4th century and beyond, as well as the revolutionary eschatology, that same word that I couldn't say, and the numerous peasant revolts that occurred in the last ages. Both the doctrine of pre-Marxist communalism and the movement of insurrection would become a part of the socialist tradition. Surveying the history of feudal Europe, Marx and Engels recognized the predecessor of socialist praxis in such movements as the 16th century Anabaptists in Germany, and in 17th century England, the Leverliers. Engels had called them forerunners of the modern proletariat. On their part, the historians of the 19th century socialist construction placed their points of origin quite firmly on French soil and among the sons and daughters of the most politically and intellectually model elements of the third estate, the bourgeoisie and the petite bourgeoisie and the artisans. Moreover, these historians of the socialist movement unanimously assert that the French Revolution, and even upon which there is less argument among them, was the more dramatic of the two moments that spurred the development of socialist ideas. As we have already noted, somewhat particularly, the Industrial Revolution, that is, the appearance of the technologically vigorous and mechanically imaginative industrial capitalism as the second moment that allowed for the subsequent development of socialist thought, has been seen as an English phenomenon. Socialist thought, negation of feudalism or capitalism, question mark. Just as the historical character of capitalist development and the working classes associated with the development can be better understood through the medieval civilization in which they were created, a similar task applies to the history of socialism. Socialism was an articulated opposition to social inequality, and poverty was first addressed in its adaptation of bourgeois society to feudal structures. Socialist critiques of society were attempts to further the bourgeois revolution against feudalism. It possessed then a moral character. The critique of property that arose with the liberalism of 18th century France was not geared in the industrial system at all, aside from advocating the private property be eliminated. It had no economic orientation. Rather, the concern of such a characteristic communist thinker of the era as morally was entirely moral, and the abolition of private ownership was for him simply the focal point of the realization, the rationalized social and political structures that would then bring about the moral regeneration of man, as Marx and Engels made obvious in the Communist Manifesto. As polemicists, their intention was to emphasize their differences with those socialist traditions that had preceded them, not to identify with them. The socialism with which they were contemporaries was generally founded on the attempt to distinguish and preserve the rights of property, bourgeoisie, from the wrongs of property, feudalism. Socialism was an expression of the social and intellectual liberation and the enlightenment of a strata of European society for which the terror of feudalism and the power of the absolute state were no longer neutral, immediate, or inevitable, as an ideology committed to the historical provincial force of science, reasons, and rationality. It was largely the what? Obviation?
Aviation.
You got to say it louder.
Obviation.
Obviation of those ideologies and structures that had served to legitimate and manifold forms of feudal and imperial authority, caste hierarchies, aristocratic privilege, the absolute power of the prince, later the state, over the peasantry, the authority and wealth of the church, and finally, the property of the powerlessness of the masses.
Poverty.
This is
The poverty
property.
and power.
Okay, the
Poverty.
poverty and the powerlessness of the masses, the cause of which early socialism was addressed, was the freeing of the secularized soul. The highest point attained by contemplative materialism, that is, materialism which does not comprehend sensuousness as practical activities, is the contemplation of a single individual in civil society. To accept the notion of frequently put forth that early socialists thought was the ideological and theoretical negation of capitalist society, industrial capitalism during the stage of competitive and monopoly capitalism, is to presume a historical relationship that is not in evidence, as Schumpeter has so cleverly cautioned. This is what he says. The question arises rather the economic interpretation of history is more than a convenient approximation which must be accepted to work less satisfactorily in some cases than it does in others. An obvious qualification occurs on the outset. Social structure types and attitudes are coined that do not readily melt. Once they are formed, they persist, possibly for centuries. And since different structures and types display different degrees of this ability to survive, we must always find the actual group of national behavior more or less departs from what we should expect to be if we tried to infer it from the dominant forms of productive processes, such as facts. Marx did not overlook, but he hardly realized all their implication. The initial appearances of modern socialism and its forms are most closely related to feudal society than it suggested by the later shapes of socialist thought would assume. Socialism began as one expression of bourgeois society and the bourgeoisie that it came to oppose explicitly. The materialist historianism of socialism is thus mistaken. That, quote, nature of socialism to which scholars like Gregory Litcham have devoted so much attention is philosophical ideological construct, an interpretation of the history of socialist thought that fixes on the variant of the traditions which was a response to the revolutionary failures of the mid-19th century, combined with the present the persistent thrust of Marx's materialism towards a positive science, the critique of capitalist mode of production, and the political history myths of Leninist revolution, the dominant legend of the socialist tradition replaced as history of socialism. The function of the alternative theory of socialism is to obscure the obvious, that the origins of socialist thought are not with the European proletariat, but the middle classes. It is not the working classes in Germany who were at the origins of socialist ideas. Socialist ideas were spread by a part of an intellectual elite who saw the proletarian masses as a possible instrument of social renewal. Indeed, the history of European socialism is dotted by a consistent opposition to the practical activity of consciousness of proletarian classes. As Marx and Engels themselves declare, the question is not what goal is envisaged,
Envisaged.
envisaged for the time being by this or that member of the proletariat, or even by the proletariat as a whole. The question is, what is the proletariat, and what course of action will it be forced historically to take in conformity with its own nature? The intelligentsia was by far the strata most likely to discern that course of action. Of course, Lenin, in substituting the Revolutionary Party for the conscious proletariat, agreed with Marx and Engels, both theoretically and programmatically. Unfortunately, neither of them recalled to any significant political purpose. Marx's warning in 1851 of the nature of their own class was it as demonstrated in Paris of 1848. One must not form a narrow-minded notion of that the petite bourgeoisie, on principle, wishes to enforce the egotistic class interest. Rather, it believes that the special conditions of its emancipation are the general conditions under which modern society can alone be saved and the class struggle avoided. The Democrats, because he presents the petite bourgeoisie, therefore the transition class, in which the interests of two classes are simultaneously deadened, imagines himself elevated above class antagonisms generally. Oh. As a class whose historical character include the ideological and administrative meditation of the bourgeoisie, mediation. No, it's meditation. Yeah. Of the bourgeoisie, rule and domination of the petite bourgeoisie tended to produce political and conceptual lactis works from which its inevitable derivative authority might extend and absorb the whole society. Sorry. All right, hold on. As a class whose historical character includes the ideological and administrative meditation of bourgeoisie rule and domination. Oh, I think I read this, didn't I? The petite bourgeoisie, I'll read it, tended to produce political and conceptual lattice works for which is inevitable derivative authority might extend and absorb the whole of society. So, as oh my gosh, here we go. Utilitarianism and functionalism have served as the basis for those elements of the petite bourgeoisie enveloped by bureaucracy. Do we know? So let's look up what utilitarianism is. I don't know exactly what it is. I'm going to look it up. Oh, don't worry. No worries. Hopefully, it'll let me do it. What do you think? Of course. Did I get it? Nope. There it
Yes.
is. Yay! So you want to read it?
Utilitarianism is a consequentialist ethical theory asserting that the best action is one that maximizes overall happiness and reduces suffering.
Okay, and we're going to look up functionalism. Okay. So we know what they're talking about. Let me go look up functionalism. Let's see what we got with. All right, go ahead. You want to here, hold on, if I can. Will it let me? Whoop. Is that better to read?
Sure. Functionalism is a theoretical perspective defining mental states or social institutions by their function, what they do, rather than their internal structure or physical composition.
There you go. That's good. That's good. All right, let's go back. Hold on a second. I'm not this smooth with this, but oh well, we'll work on it. There we go. Back to Black Marxism. All right, sweet. The cool thing about this is it's all black. Yeah, has served as a basis for those elements. So as utilitarianism and functionalism had served as a basis for those elements of the petite bourgeoisie, enveloped by bureaucracy, commerce, and professions. That is the mainstream of capitalist social order. Socialism became a pennant of those members of the petite bourgeoisie, uh, upheld by the cruel lack of restraint and the chaotically foreshortening vision of the bourgeoisie. So they're saying
Okay,
that
so
a
it's a
lot of
pennant.
huh? Go ahead.
Sorry, it's a pennant, and that's a flag, like a
Thank you.
little flag, like a little triangle flag.
Yeah. So it looks like that they're saying that a lot of the socialist ideas and thoughts came down from the bourgeoisie and stuff like that. Petite. Marx wasn't petite though. He was probably one of the working class people. Engels was a bourgeoisie, but he did class trading by supplying funds and resources to the movement. You know what I mean? So that's a little different. So he was a class trader. Yeah. From Babeuf of Marx
Baboof.
and
It's baboof.
Babeuf of Marx and curious historiography. What does Bambouf mean? Is that the name of a person?
It's a person, yeah.
Huh. Just I'm curious. Hold on. Supposedly, it's a French revolutionary and journalist. Don't know what type of revolutionary he is, but yeah. The industrial working class constituted a minority of the workers of England and France at the moments when modern socialism began to take form. Indeed, much of the revolutionary agitation that marked this period was pushed forward by crowds dominated by artisans and shopkeepers. Petite, yeah. Albert Sobol, for instance, indicates that though the most powerful element of the third estate of the French Revolutionary period was bourgeoisie, two-thirds of the order, that is, that is its Jacobin wing, were artisans and shopkeepers. England and France, the latter as the most industrialized economy in the continental Europe, were still essentially agrarian societies when their working class movement assumed class specific ideological and organizational forms in the 1930s and 1940s being developed. Even then, for example, Rude speaks of the importance of, quote, the survival of traditional ideas and values, end quote, in movements that were to come so close to power. The relationship between the social movement and the lower classes and the socialist intelligentsia was at least ambiguous. Students of socialism generally argued that the socialist tradition that would come to be closely identified with the industrial proletariat begins in 1795 with the conspiracy of equals in the Francisco Noel Grotas Bumfood was so prominent. GDH Cole, with apparent approval, notes that Bumfood's conspiracy
Ooh, it's Babu.
conspiracy continued to be regarded by revolutionary socialists and is today regarded by communists as the first planned manifestation of the proletariat and revolutionary action, proclaiming from afar the new revolution, which was destined to complete the work begun in 1789. Lichdem quite naturally makes an identical remark before proceeding to the declaration of the direct legacy from Buffoon to Lenin. Babeuf had his associates appear as the precursors of 19th century radicals like Blanquin, and at a remove of the Russian revolutionary populists of 1860s and 1870s was those whose heritage was subsequently assumed by the Bolsheviks. With Lechman's lineage may be problematic, certain similarities are obvious between the movement at which the Baboofists, and the Bolsheviks emerged from their respective revolutionary situation. Since it is the conspiracy of equals that is likely to be the lesser known, some details might be appropriate to demonstrate this apparent similarity. By 1794, that is year 2 of the French Republic, the most radical of the several bourgeoisie-dominated governments established in Paris had been overthrown, and its leading citizens, most prominently Rosenspire, had been executed, exiled, or forced to flee to the countryside and beyond. The reaction that followed under the Directory had abolished remember we read some of this stuff in the Black Jacobin. The Directory and Rosenspire and Jacobins had established a radical legislation and an egalitarian policy of the direct economy decree the year before. The limitations of prices, the maximum, the taxation of wealthy classes, national assistance to the poor, free and compulsory education, the confiscation of and distribution to poor and emery property were either repelled or discontinued in practice, as had been the case on several previous occasions since the aristocracy power had been challenged. The revolutionary crowds of France towns and cities, and the peasants in the countryside began to suspect that the revolution was being betrayed. This time the traitors were the reactionary bourgeoisie, those members of the class whose wealth and power the revolution had already secured. The execution of the leaders of the Jacobin left wing of the convention, removed from the Parisian sans culottes, those elements, the Montagnard. Yeah, de Montagnard. I can't say it. What is that? Let's find out what that is. What is a I'm gonna figure it out. We're gonna figure it out.
I'm 90% sure it's a political party.
To it, it says 30 indigenous tribes in the mountain of it's Montagnard. So it's something to do with Vietnam. So I don't think I could get it. Damn. Which had been the most responsive to its demands. Those members of the left wing that had survived its repression had gone underground, frequently organizing themselves into secret societies and clubs. One such group was a remnant of the Union des Pantheon, the conspirators, while Babeuf and his comrades were negotiating in 1796 with the Jacobins underground. They were betrayed by the military association. Christel, Christel acted as a spy for the Directory. Fuck you. At their subsequent trial, in a year, it says 1797, the intent of the conspiracy of equals was revealed for the first time. They had they had projected a seizure of power by the small revolutionary group of leaders who were then to establish a revolutionary government based on their following among the Parisians' local societies, with the intention of summoning, as speedily as possible, a national assembly to be elected under the democratic franchises of the abortive constitution in 1793, which had never been allowed to come into force. So this is like this is the shit. This is like during the times that we talk about the San Domingo and shit. Wild. Hold on, what am I doing? Pending the break. I'm on there where it says pending the breaking into action, right?
Pending the bringing.
Yeah, pending the bringing into action of this constitution, Babeuf, Babeuf and his followers proposed to establish a temporary dictatorship based mainly on the Paris workers, but they had no theory of revolution, much less of proletarian dictatorship, as more than an expedient and transition over a short period of a fully democratic constitution based on the manhood suffrage. They did, however, propose to proceed immediately to large measures of expropriation and redistribution of property holdings on the basis of communal appropriations and enjoyment of all goods. Such were the beginnings of the notion of proletarian dictatorship in the European socialism. It is a heritage that tends to confirm Marx's later characterization of the petite bourgeoisie, while suggesting some of the political forms and consequences of such presumptions. It is also useful to note that at no point had the conspiracy become a popular or mass movement. Cole observes that the Babeuf's movement never really took shape as a nationwide revolutionary campaign. It found its support, as the Jacobins had done, mainly in the large towns and preemptively in Paris. There, where its following was attracted to it mainly by the conditions of scarcity and unemployment, the following upon and that followed upon the reluctance of emancipating peasants to keep the town supplied with the necessary of life, the necessaries of life. Nor did it ever command more than a small fraction, even of the urban proletariat. It was a conspiracy of a few who aimed at drawing after them the large elements of urban discontent arising mainly out of sheer hunger. It would be another 30 years before a working class movement gave evidence of its influence, a much longer than that before the principles of the socialist society becoming dominant in European social movements. Following the execution of Babeuf and his co-conspirators, it is not until almost mid-century, the years noted of the appearance of Marx and Engels, that the thinkers of the socialist tradition became actively engaged to working class politics. The historians of socialist thought take this period for what it was in relations to their subject, and unanimously committed themselves to exegesis. Exegesis? We're gonna look up that word.
It's a good idea because that's like exegesis.
Exegeses. That's funny. That's what it said. That's how he said it. Exegeses. Oh well. I thought it was funny. Come on. There you go. You want to read it? You don't have to. You don't want to.
I'm sorry, I disassociated.
You want to read it or not?
Exegesis, plural of exegesis, are critical, detailed explanations or interpretations of texts, commonly religious scriptures, for example, the Bible or complex literature.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So it sounds like that they're talking about Marx and Engels being complex in their uh, in their engagement with, yeah. The literary pamphleteering of the historical works of forgotten and dimly remembered writers, with the rare interpretation of a, oh my gosh, boy narratia, blanquin, or blank, are sequences of form of tapestry of socialist thought. It is a period dominated by eccentric, eccentrics, eccentrics, visionaries, and didacts. Ugh. The wistful trials of Goodwin, Paine, Fourier, St. Simons, Cadets, Paquer, lesser and grander lights preoccupied the historians, along with the most often short-lived utopian communities associated with some of them. The agitation, rebellions, riots, and struggles of artisans, wage laborers, peasants, and slave laborers are largely irrelevant in the traditions in the early 19th centuries and mostly constitute a background, quote, noise in this era of socialist writer. The, quote, historical issues that arise are each writer's contribution to socialist theory, and whether or not the, quote, systems that were constructed should properly be categorized as socialist, quote unquote. This is a particular telling historical project since so many of the historians, the Coles, the Lechmans, Beers, are themselves sympathetic to the traditions they reconstruct. Their work becomes a demonstration of the independence of socialist theory and socialist movement for one another. So this is the history. We're going over the history of this shit. When once again they collided in the 1840s, 1870s, and early 1900s, each had assumed forms of prerogative. Wait, pre, whoa,
You had it.
pre
You had it. Prerogatives.
prerogatives,
Yeah.
only slightly tolerable to those of the other. While the movements of the working classes tended towards the accommodation with capitalism in the form of trade unionist demands, abandoning revolutionary initiatives to those whose social origins were most often the peasants and petit bourgeois classes. Socialist theory became more and more dominated by the figures of the revolutionary proletariat. Marx, under the influence of both of his readings of Hegel and his intense encounters with a number of intellects of his own generation, who had identified themselves as Hegelian, David Strauss, Bruno Bauer, Karl Koppen, Mosey Hess, Lorenz von Stein, Ludwig Feuerbach, had sought to construct the epistemological system founded in materialism as a, oh my gosh, a meta-theoretic and current underneath social structures and forms. Meta-theoretic means like the meta, I'm guessing. I can look it up. Let's look it up. Meta-theoretic.
Meta theoretic. Like it describes itself.
It's a theory about theory. That's what it says.
Yeah,
Currency.
that's what I was trying to explain. It says what it says in its name. It's theoretic, having to do with theories, and meta, having to do with all.
Yeah. The currency underneath social structures and forms. My inquiry led me to the conclusion that neither legal relations nor political forms could be comprehended rather by themselves or on the basis of a so-called general development of the human mind, but that on the contrary, they originate in the material conditions of life, that the autonomy of this civil society has to be sought in political economy. History of Marx became the antagonistic play of the relations of living social categories. Those existence was predicated on a particular character of production and property that had been the basis of social life. Political economy was thus the most fundamental historical inquiries. The materialist conception of history situated in objective and necessary forces of society, distinguishing their significance from those categories of human activity that were the result of pure speculation. Idealism and ideology, as Marx's theoretical work proceeded, the progressive tendency to place the study of capitalist form of production, exchange, and distribution at the center of his work become more and more pronounced. By 1847, capitalism had become this primary subject. His infrequent sojourning into the studies of revolutions were dictated by their occurrence. He would write in 1850 articles later published as The Class Struggle of France, and in 1851, the 18th premiere of Louis Bonaparte, as studies of the 1848 revolutionary movement in France. And in 1871, the Civil War in France was a statement of the Paris Commune of the same year, and the degree on which Marx believed them to be important testaments of the political and methodological efficiency of the materialist conception of history. Marx, Engels, and nationalism. Here we go. The bulk of the almost 2 decades. Do we have any questions before I move on to this one?
Nope, I'm getting it pretty good.
Okay. Anybody else? I don't think so. There's only like 2 of us in here. Marx, Engels, and nationalism. The bulk of the almost 2 decades that Marx spent on his economics, quote unquote, largely sandwiched between the revolution of 1848 and the appearance of the rather more ambiguous International in 1864, though substantially marked by intensive research, writing, mathematical training, and theoretical development, was also a period of extreme frustration, plagued by what he constantly referred to as bourgeois troubles, indebtedness, familial demands and disruptions, and debilitating illnesses, carbuncles and boils. Marx celebrated temper, and sometimes mean preoccupations propelled him into drawn quarrels. Some petty, but no less vicious, with Karl Vogt, Ferdinand Lassalle, the dirty, oh, I can't say that, the bad person that's Jewish, Galepsy Mazina, and even one, probably the only one, with Engels following the death of Mary Burns. Most of the results of Marx's proprietary attitude. What?
I'm gonna say it at the end of the sentence.
Say it.
I just wanted to say, I think communists come by it naturally, because Marx is up here arguing with everybody.
Marx's proprietary attitude towards the party, the Communist League, which he himself in 1860 had declared defunct since 1852. One of these disputes, however, is particularly instructive here, for it reveals in dramatic terms the ideological restraint and theoretical bounds that placed Marx and Engels at a special disadvantage in their confrontation with the form of nationalism beginning to surface by the mid 19th century. Because nationalism is the most important ideology of our time, its treatment by Marx and Engels and later Marxists can be informative both with respects of the essence of Marxist thought as well as the nature of ideology. The nationalism in question was German, a nation from which Marx and Engels had been enforced exiled for several years. Exile, however, is hardly the satisfactory defense in this instance, since Marx and Engels was leader of the German democratic socialist movement, were in most daily touch with German correspondents. It is true that as Emery's from Germany, Marx and Engels can be expected to have drawn increasingly distant from the ambition and moods of the working class organization at home. Franz Mehring, one of Marx's most sympathetic biographers, notes that in Marx and Engels' argument with Lassalle over the consequences of German revolutionary struggle of the war between Germany, Prussia, and the German League, Italy, and the Kingdom of Sardinia in France, quote, the two friends had to pay for having lost touch with conditions in Germany for so long, giving the world historical scope that Marx and Engels attempted to achieve in their works. However, Mehring's intervention by interpretation appears excessively apologetic and not practically instructive. He failed to come to terms with the political ideological effect that Marx's notion of the logic of capitalist development would incur. In brief, the situation was this: neither Italy, Germany, or France, and for the matter Austria, had ever achieved territorial configuration that conformed to the ambition of their ruling and military elites, nor the natural ethnic and linguistic affections of their nationalistic citizenry. Cavour, the prime minister of Sardinian kingdom, had gradually been converted from the repressive anti-nationalist to the extremely skilled ununificationist. What?
Unification.
Factitionist.
Unificationist. Unificationist.
We're going to look it up anyways.
Yeah. Sometimes you say it's wrong. I mess up.
It said a member of the Unification Church. I don't know.
Yeah.
By the pres-
Unification.
by the persistent development and growth of nationalist sympathies and organization both on the Italian peninsula and among the exiles his government had been so instrumental in relocating. By the outbreak of the Crimean War in 1854, Cavour had become convinced that the French army would be the critical tool for the expulsion of Austria from central Italy and the achievement of a decisive advantage for Piedmont, continental Sardinia, over the Papal States. Cavour appears to have presumed the kingdom of the two Sicilies beyond his reach. Cavour saw to it that Sardinia troops accompanied the British and French armies when they invaded Russia in 1854. The Crimean War ultimately resulted in the weakening of both Austria and Russia, and at the peace conference in Paris, 1865, Austria's Italian professions, Vendetti and Lombardy, became a matter of discussion as a breach in the Vienna Settlement, 1815. It appears that diplomatic considerations and the brutal and continuing suppression of Italian rebels by Austria had joined to make Austria Austria's position in Italy unattainable. By July 1854, Napoleon III convinced on the one hand as a Bonaparte that Italy was ancestral country, was ancestral country, and on the other that French power required a large destiny than that bounded by the defeat of his imperial uncle, had met secretly with Covera and agreed on a joint venture against Austria. Piedmont was to lure Austria into declaration of war. The French army would intervene against the aggressor Austria. France would be rewarded by the ceding of Savoy and Nice Providence. Sardinia by incorporating Lombardy, Veneti, and the central duchies would become the kingdom of North Italy. Mirroring continues the story. One New Year's Day, 1854, Bonaparte received the Austrian ambassador in audience and informed him of the French intentions, lest a few days later the King of Sardinia announced to the world that he was not deaf to the heart-rending appeals of the Italian people. These threats were perfectly understood by Venia. The Austrian government was clumsy enough to let itself be maneuvered into the role of attacker. Half bankrupt, attacked by France, and threatened by Russia, it was in a difficult position. So it therefore sought to win the support of the German League. It tried to persuade the League that the maintenance of Austria oppression in Italy was a matter of vital national importance for Germany. Jesus, I'm like burping nonstop. In order to comprehend the response of Marx and Engels to this situation, it is firstly necessary to know more about the Germany from which they came and the Germany in which Austria appealed. The defeat of Napoleonic armies and the 1850 settlement of Vienna that followed had not resulted in the reunification of Germany. The Holy Alliance, the Reich, whose most recent manifestation was the alliance between Persia, the Confederation of the Rhine,
Not
and
Persia. Not
yeah,
Persia. Prussia.
yeah, thank you, which had been dissolved in 1806, was entirely frustrated by the statesmanship whose architect was Austria. Oh my gosh, Metternich. What does Metternich mean? We're gonna find out that. Hopefully, it'll
I
let
think
me
it's
do
a
it.
person. Yeah, I think it's a person.
You'd be right. It is a person, and that was dominated by the interests of Austria, Russia, and Great Britain. Between 1815 and 1866, Germany, the Deutscher Bund, consisted of 38 states or principalities, including the four free cities of Hamburg, Bremen, Lembeck, and Frankfurt. Even during the War of Liberation, 1812 to 15, that that particularism of the German principalities had been persistent, causing John Frederick Boehmer, father to write to his son, the future historian, quote, unhappily, those fighting for great patriotic cause are not so much Germans as Bavarians. Wittenberg, Hassans, Saxons, Nasir, Weisenberg, and even subjects of the petty state of Junsenberg within the bound of league. Prussia emerged as the most powerful competitor to Austria on the basis of its army and its bureaucracy, the legacy of French rule. W.H. Henderson indicates that Germany, at the beginning of the 19th century, was much less industrialized than France. The industrialization of Germany really began in 1830s and 1840s with the introduction of steam powered machinery and the importation of skilled artisans from England to operate mold jennies in the cotton mills of Saxon, built textile machinery in steamships, and inaugurated power loom weaving on Lower Silesia. Up through the mid-19th century, however, Germany was still overwhelmingly agricultural. And despite an estimate of 39% rise in population between 1815 and 1845, the proportion of the town and country dwellers remained virtually unchanged. Few towns have recovered from the effects of the 30 Years' War, the stagnation of the 18th century, and at the beginning of the 19th century, the total population of all the free cities and university towns of Germany were scarcely the equivalent of the population of Paris. Hence, neither industrial capitalists nor industrial workers existed as a serious political force, and the town were still, as in the 18th century, dominated by the professional and bureaucratic middle class, which had little to gain by radical political change. Still, it was largely out of this middle class that early 19th century liberalism and nationalism found their social base. Cloud indeed expressed some surprise that, quote, radical and national feeling, end quote, would persist so long in Germany as to achieve popular support in German revolutions. Oh, move. It's not moving. There it goes. Hold on. In German revolutions of 1848. When crowds of artisans and workers arose in Vienna and Berlin in that year, the liberal elements of the middle class were not enthusiastic, choosing political and abdicate their monetary advantages rather than provide any further momentum to the revolution. As we shall see that Marx and Engels, as members of that generation, the class that had committed themselves to the democratization and reunification of Germany, were thus deeply implicated and consequently ambivalent towards the event that affects these interests between the liberal defection of 1849 and the assumption of power in Prussia by Bismarck in 1862. Lichman is quite correct to observe that neither the Marxian theory of democracy nor the Marxian view of national evolution is fully comprehensible unless it is remembered that they took shape on the morrow of the worst defeat democracy and nationalism had yet suffered in Europe, when the liberals, parliamentarians, abandoned the attempt of democratic reforms in May 1846, the future of German liberalism and nationalism was remanded into the hands of Prussian Junker class. The first liberalism was to be destroyed as a threat to that class. The second retained as a weapon of class against Austrian ambition. Bismarck realized that despite the setbacks of 1848-1849, German liberalism and nationalism supported by Austria were still a serious threat to Prussian particularism and the Prussian aristocratic privilege. Liberalism was fatal to the social order for which Bismarck stood, but nationalism, carefully handled, could be made to subverse the purpose of Prussia. He separated German national aspirations from the liberal background, which from 1813 to 1848 and the centuries past have given them meaning. Nationalism had grown strong as an instrument of liberal reform, as an essential means of breaking the stronghold of particularist interest over the German people. He offered the German people unity, but at the expense of radical reforms which alone made unity worthwhile. Bismarck, as we know, was successful, but not on the basis of sheer energy or diplomatic acumen. The economic prosperity between 1850 and 1871 of the industrializing Germany had made radical, that is, liberal reform less urgent, while ambiguous international machination of the persistent hostilities of Napoleon III to Germany unity underscored the logic of nationalism. As we return to the first month of the war, these dynamics and their history should be kept in mind. And though the era of Bismarck takes us beyond the moment of the Italian War, some familiarity with these later events is used since they indicate the momentum of certain social progress more clearly evident to Lassalle than Marx and Engels. Engels' reaction to the outbreak of war of 1859 between Austria and Sardinia and France, and to the German nationalist movement that had attended the prelude of war, was to publish a pamphlet entitled Poe and Rhine. Lassalle's acted for Engels as his German agent with Franz Danker, while Marx gave his enthusiastic support to the project. Sorry, I have to do a visualization thing because it hates me. Anyways, in his pamphlet, Engels argues that though the Po River boundary was of no military significance to Germany, in these terms, Engels added France's claims were more defensible. Politically, the French encroachment on the Po was the beginning of an attempt to recapture the Rhine frontier. On this basis, Engels insisted that Po was where Germany must make its stand with Austria. The pamphlet was published in Germany anonymously on the advice of Marx, so as to give the impression that the author was probably a Prussian general, a stratagem that was apparently quite successful to Marx's great satisfaction. He wrote to Engels, congratulating him on the fact that that he induced identity, he was now being celebrated in their homeland as a military expert. The extent of Marx and Engels there, ulterior motives, as they put it, has been reconstructed by Mering. First of all, both Marx and Engels believed that national movements in Germany was a really genuine one. The instinct of the people demanded war against Louis Bonaparte as a representative of the traditions of the First French Empire, and this instinct was right. Secondly, they assumed that Germany was really seriously threatened by the Franco-Russian alliance. And finally, in their opinion, the German government needed goading on by the national movement, and what they then expected was described by Engels in a passage of a letter to Lassalle. Quote, "Long live a war in which we are attacking simultaneously by the French and the Russians, for in which a desperate situation with disaster immediately threatens all parties, from those which are now ruling the Zetz and Blum, who exhaust themselves. The nation would then finally turn to the most energetic party in order to save itself." Hold on a second. We're on page what? 114. Remember 114, please. 114. Oh my God. I think that's a good. Well, no. Let's see. 114 to 6 pages. I don't know if I can't read 6 pages in 10 minutes. So 114. Does that seem like a good stopping point? That's why I stopped there.
Yes.
Okay. So we're stopping at, but the Mering did not recognize. Okay. We might have to go back a couple.
Yeah. So
So what do you think?
114.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think is going on?
Well, let's see. I like the way Engels snuck in their pamphlet to get people to listen to them, but I do agree they should, because they, even though they were exiled from Germany, they should have paid more attention to the German Revolution that was going on at home. I think that's a valid criticism.
Yeah. Looks like they're getting ready to like fight off the French and stuff like that. Their whole talk is on nationalism, um, because there's the thing on the national question, and there's different approaches on the national question that should be observed. But in their situation, um, I don't know. I don't know the complete situation there. I know they had feudal relations in some senses, and like were being nationally oppressed. So yeah, it seems like. So they're coming up with like ways and how to engage with that. Hold on. Is anybody ready to come up? Anybody else can come up too. But
Well,
you don't have to.
duly requested. Yay.
Go ahead and bring them up. I'll go on mute real quick. Go ahead, Dooley.
Yeah. I don't have much to say because I did come in late because there was a big conversation prior. But from what I did get, yeah, I would have the same analysis as Joe, that it was a valid critique. You don't need to apologize, chicken strips. It was a valid critique that they weren't paying attention to some of the stuff that they should have because they had certain connections to it.
It was because they were exiled.
Yeah,
No,
but
I,
That's why they were exiled.
they were exiled, but they were still they. It even says in the book that they should have been paying closer attention to what was going on at home.
Well, I can understand the hardship of doing that because how are you supposed to meet the thing where it's at when you're in a different country? You can only base it off of what you get informational wise, because Marxism was about meeting the conditions and
Right.
observing those conditions and doing investigation. So I can, it's a good critique, but I can also see the position of only getting informational system and not seeing the objective reality that's going on too. So there's two things can be at once. Yes, correct, and at the same time they weren't at where the thing was happening. You know what I mean?
Right. They did say though that he was in constant communication with Germany.
Yeah. So they got informational secondhand stuff that would probably be delayed because we also got to look at there's no internet either, right? So how long did it take letters and communications to get there? You know what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah, we get that. I'm just saying that, like, um, if Marx can like make claims with uh the similar thing happening with uh like, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying on this end, uh when he makes a similar situation of like indigenous people or people of Africa, he's able to have his analysis there, but it doesn't seem to stretch to a place that he has a connection to. I can see where the critique comes from.
No, 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 no. I get it. I get it. I get it. No, I like I said, two things can be true at one time. Yes, he had a bad analysis, but also how was the information brought to him? You know, those are the other types of material conditions. But I agree, you know, because like how am I going to know the exact material conditions of somewhere in Algeria? I can read books and look up stuff, but I need to see the engagement too at the same time. That's why Marxism is an actual thing where you have to actually go out and do actions. You know what I mean? Whether the actions look, whatever the action looks like. You know what I mean?
Uh,
I don't get man Marx either.
no, that happened within the conversation we were
Yeah.
having prior.
That's my
A
suggestion
certain,
is go ahead.
I was just gonna say real quickly, a certain person disappointed a lot of us. Um,
Mhm.
and claimed that if we didn't follow what oh, what Marx or Engels said to the T, that we might not be communists.
Huh. Interesting. That's interesting. That's interesting. What we should do is be studying the science of dialectical materialism. That's the most important part because, like I say, was 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 gravity invented, or was it observed and took down? Which one was it?
Yeah, we tried to explain that very thing
Yeah.
to
So the
that
most important.
person,
So the most
but
important
they
part is this. Sorry.
sorry. I'll I'll be quick. But instead of listening, they pulled a Christian and said, "You're not reading it right," even though I was reading directly from the book we were talking about.
Okay. Okay. All right. Was this the trot?
Yeah,
Ah, yes. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
they were doing
Um.
anthropocentrism as well.
Yeah. Communists. They were great. I know. I know. The people great man things. And the thing is, the most important part of this, because every person that has done these works, I gotta do appeal. Have have mistakes and flaws. Every human has flaws and mistakes. That's the whole point, is to take on the science and bring it on, but also you're not going to know if the science works if you don't see it live in its motions and in its relations to other things and phenomenons. You have to see the thing in the living instance, right? We can have theory based on the material conditions to reflect on, but we have to actively change the material conditions to see a thing work in the reality of the world. So our best thing to do is to study the silence of dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and materialist dialectics, because it is a science that I agree with, and it's been perpetuated by other human beings to bring on more advances and to bring theory, just like Newtonian. What's his name? Was Isaac Newton? Newtonian is advanced through, but not taking away from, Einsteinianism. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Because the science, to say that the science stops at Marx and Engels is to stagnate it. To say it doesn't progress any further. To say that people cannot look at material conditions and do an analysis and then put it in peer review, because that's what we should do. When I have an analysis of something, I should put it in a type of peer review with my fellow comrades to make sure that I'm engaging correctly, because I think that's the whole point, that the proletarian science, Marxism, is based on a collective movement, in my personal opinion. It requires all of us to engage to make sure we're doing the correct things and that we're actually observing whatever we put into motion and making sure that it has development in a progressive way and doesn't stagnate. I'm sorry. So, yeah. Anyways, does anybody else have anything to say?
I have two things to say. First
Sure.
thing's to Rachel. I would like to announce this for Rachel after what they just wrote. It. And the second thing is, I love you, goodbye.
Love you too.
Much love. Take care.
All right, everybody. And I'm thinking that Two Spirit and Joe, Chickens are doing a reading on people's history of indigenous people's history, I think. So after that, I'm going to go over there and then I'm going to read my book before I go to bed. Because it's teaching me a lot about dialectics. All right, hold on. Chicken's coming up. Hello.
Not that one. We're doing one of, I forgot what it was. We're doing one of Nick Estes books
Our
first.
our history is the future. Is that the one?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
Is
what we're
that
doing first.
We just today. Today.
yeah? How much of the reading are you gonna do? Just curious. You gonna try to finish it all, or are you gonna do half and half?
kind of up to two spirit.
Okay. Okay. All right. Because I'm gonna take some time to also go back to my studying. When I'm reading this book on C.L.R. James, it's freaking helping me with my dialectics much more. So that's why I want to
It's
also do that. But I want to come to this. Is it
great.
done by Nick Estes?
Yeah.
Didn't you? Oh yeah, it's Standing Rock.
Mhm.
It's Standing Rock, and then it's a lot of history. It's a lot more history. It's got a lot of history.
Okay, cool, 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 cool. I look forward to it.
I'm just still flabbergasted that someone looked indigenous people in the face and said, "You're not actually communist because you don't follow Marx word by word." The fuck?
That's wild. Vulcan seems to be good because they think that the lumpen proletariat is a revolutionary subject. So that's
They
cool.
got dropped too. I forgot what the reason they got dropped.
Because you say they focus so much on the material base, but I understand the alienation part. They think that through the material base of social revolution, alienation can be dealt with because those are aspects, which I can see his position. It's not a completely egregious
Her,
position, you know?
both of the people that we could be talking about are
Sure.
trans women or
Yeah,
like go by
I
she
keep doing that. I
or
don't know why I
they
do that.
they she
She
pronouns.
and they, both of them are she. Both of them are she. She, I understand. I understand her position as Boken and stuff like that. It's not an egregious white supremacist position because they do talk. She does talk about the aspects of alienation and how they need to be dealt with. So she still has that in their engagement. So they're not as egregious. I would say just my opinion, but it's not my space.
But here's the okay. So if we're talking about the one with like the red profile pic with
Hmm.
like the hammer and sickle and like the thick ink like lines in the
Hmm.
background, um I had to try and explain to them that to tackle the issue, you can't be running away from the issue when it
Hmm.
comes to culture. And they just kept on saying the same shit. Like if you address uh the if you address the class, you address everything else. And I just kicked her at that point. And
I sit in the
for
position of Maoism because I believe in destroying the material base and doing a cultural revolution of the superstructure.
yeah, I think that I honestly think that a cultural revolution needs to happen throughout the whole thing before, during, and after.
Mhm.
Um, but when it, and then when it came to the other person, uh, the they ended up they ended up uh, agreeing until it came to the point of consciousness. Then they started going down like anthropocentrism, trying to say that humans are more special, which more special is not a thing. Special is just meaning different in some sort of way. Uh, but like, and we tried to explain to them that uh, that you can't be more special, and that your consciousness doesn't strictly come from labor, and that it comes from relationship to the world in general. And like it, I don't want to monopolize on this. Chicken can explain if she wants.
The only critique I have though, is to everybody. I understand we don't focus on the material base, but like you have to conjoin and unite those two things. They stand in contradictions to each other, of course. They impact each other. There are dialectics, so you have to engage with those impacts. Sometimes they play a leading role, and sometimes they don't play the leading role. So that's why you have to put in unity, the superstructure ideals of structures, and you have to put the material base together so that way you can have a full-fledged conscious effort, because you have to do two things at once. So those things have to be in our minds, like together, if that makes sense.
But they're not wanting that. They were just worried about the one part. They're not
Yeah.
worried about the other parts, and that was our main issue, I think. But also, they apparently agreed with Marx and their racism when they were saying that slaves are better off than like the proletariat.
Yeah, the whole thing that was Engels
They straight
and
up agreed with it.
that was
Yeah.
Engels and Principles of the Communism. That was Engels. Yeah. Marx actually went out to Africa to figure out the colonial situation. He doesn't have enough time to go through his whole analysis. We have to also understand too that people develop their their consciousness as they develop and come in contact with other knowledge and stuff like that too. So there's a development from where I started from to where I'm at now. You know what I mean? So, but
This is this person refused to develop.
yeah, yeah. Joe's going to go over eventually the second part of the Marxist-Leninist text of historical materialism. That might be a good idea to maybe sit in on a couple of those to have a better understanding, so that we can engage with these people much better too, you know, with that, and we can actually have like, hey, you know what, this, you know. But it's up to you guys. You don't have to.
We're still kind of at the beginning of the first book because we take our time, we go back over things, we discuss things until we understand them. And so I think we're on part like 3-2 or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. So, um, yeah. Is anybody mad at me now? Anybody have any critiques or criticisms or something they want to talk to me about?
I do not.
Nope.
Chicken?
No, I don't. I
Okay.
don't. Um, Again, it just there was a lot of like in that whole live period they were just talking as if the lumpen proletariat can't come to a class consciousness, like they aren't able to. It was just very ableist. You could hear it going down
Reductive.
road so
Reductive
many
too.
times. Yeah.
Yeah, it's reductive too. You know? So, all right,
Yeah,
what do you
and
guys go?
also, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it all
No, go ahead.
it's also, sorry, outside stuff. It's also the fact that when they asked for like if whether or not the lumpen proletariat are consistently uh, whether or not they're consistently revolutionary, I asked them the same question. I asked them to apply that same question to the proletariat that are not lumpen, and and they they acknowledged that at the beginning, but as the conversation went on, they kept reverting to logic that ended up stating that uh, that that doesn't need to apply.
Yeah, yeah. Everybody's capable, you know. No one's not incapable, you know. You just got to give people the conditions to be able to develop. You know what I mean? That's what I think. So, because
Yeah,
like I think the peasantry could have been taught if they gave them the time. You know, my personal opinion. Some people think, well, they're not teachable, and it's like that's bullshit. So, all right. Does anybody have anything else to say before I drop it? I close it out. All right. Everything in their theory revolves around labor value and nothing else. Yeah, I can understand that. All right. Well, I'm gonna drop. Are you starting at 9 o'clock, Chicken?
I'm starting whenever Two Spirit messages me and tells me that they're ready.
Okay. All right then. All right. I love y'all. Y'all have a good night.